He's the soul behind Yesterday, the quiet bass line beneath the spotlight of the Beatles' Paul McCartney, a name that needs no introduction. At 82, he's often called the richest musician on the planet, with a net worth of over $1.2 billion, an empire of real estate stretching from London to Scotland, and one of the most valuable music catalogs in history. But what no one talks about is the road behind it all, about the boy who lost his mother at just 14, about the man once blamed for breaking up the Beatles, and about the husband who stood helpless as cancer took the love of his life, his wife of more than 3 decades. With all that heartache, how did he find the strength to stand up and keep writing music? If you've ever loved a Paul McCartney song, stay with this video. Because behind those melodies is a man who chose to keep living, even when it meant starting again from pain. This isn't just a story about music. It's the story of a life of someone who kept moving forward when the world expected him to fall. If you enjoy videos like this, please don't forget to hit the like button. It really helps us a lot, and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. That boy once sat alone in a cold room, strumming his guitar while frost clung to the window panes and wartime moss still crept along the walls. His mother died when he was just 14, and from that moment on, the world grew eerily quiet. But no one could have guessed out of that silence he would write some of the most timeless love songs of the century. Liverpool, 1942, when James Paul McCartney was born. England was still under the shadow of war. He grew up in a working-class neighborhood, in a small house with 2 bedrooms and a corrugated roof that rattled with the sea wind. His father, Jim, played piano in a local amateur band. His mother, Mary, was a nurse always busy, but somehow gentle enough to turn a modest kitchen into the warmest place in the house. Music drifted through Paul's childhood like breath itself. Each evening, his mother would hum a folk tune while his father played a few soft chords on the worn-out piano. In a home where very little was certain, music was the one thing that never ran out. Then in 1956, Mary passed away from breast cancer. Paul was just a boy. The house lost the sound of her footsteps, the warmth of her voice, and the world, for him, suddenly fell silent in a way no one could quite explain. "I didn't know who would understand me anymore," Paul once recalled. So he retreated into his small room, teaching himself to play guitar by listening to Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, and the old tunes his father used to play. No one told Paul he had to learn. He simply played as if it were the only way to hold on to something living, to fill the space his mother had left behind. Liverpool in those days was gray and damp, but echoes of American rock and roll pulsed through church halls and cafe speakers, offering a way out, and in 1957 at a church fete in Woolton, Paul met John Lennon, another boy who had lost his mother, another soul adrift in pain. After a performance by the Quarrymen, John turned to Paul and asked, "Do you want to play with us?" No contract, no plan, just 2 battered guitars and a silent understanding. That very first night they played together, Paul's chords blended with John's voice like 2 lost boys who had finally found a place to belong. Perhaps that moment when private grief met public harmony was the true beginning of the Beatles. And so the question remains, could a boy who lost his mother turn sorrow into songs that made the whole world stop and listen? Before the knighthood, before the million-dollar mansions and crowds of screaming fans, they were just 4 young men playing music in a smoky bar in Hamburg. But from that lowest point, they began a journey that would redefine the history of music. In 1960, what started as church hall gigs by the Quarrymen evolved into a band the world would come to know as the Beatles. At just 18, Paul McCartney left Liverpool with John Lennon, George Harrison, and later Ringo Starr, to take a leap no one could have imagined to Hamburg, Germany. But Hamburg wasn't glamorous. It was smoke-filled bars, drunk customers, grueling 7-hour sets every night, and sleeping on wooden floors behind the speakers. And yet, it was in that darkness that the Beatles sharpened their craft night after night until every finger movement, every chord, became second nature. How does an 18-year-old kid playing music in a seedy bar manage to drive all of America wild just a few years later? 2 years later, they landed in America, backstage at the Ed Sullivan Show. Paul was so nervous he nearly dropped his bass. His hands were shaking, his heart racing, but the moment the lights came on, he stepped forward, smiled, and melted the hearts of over 70 million Americans watching on TV. From a small Liverpool train station, he now stood at the center of the biggest entertainment stage in the world. And then the music just poured out, "Can't Buy Me Love, Yesterday, I Want to Hold Your Hand," alongside John Lennon. Paul didn't just write catchy songs, they created heartfelt, soul-stirring anthems that reshaped youth culture as we know it. The 1967 album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band became a landmark not just in music, but in how art and technology could merge to tell a story through sound. But every spotlight casts a shadow and cracks began to form behind the scenes. Paul, becoming increasingly meticulous, started fine-tuning every drum beat, every harmony, something that George Harrison and Ringo often found stifling. During the Let It Be sessions, Paul and John clashed over a single vocal line. The room went quiet, not because they hated each other, but because so much weight rested on every note they played. Maybe that perfectionism is what made their music eternal, but also what slowly pulled them apart. Still, amid the tension, one moment remains unforgettable. In 1965, Queen Elizabeth II awarded all four Beatles the MBE honor. As Paul stepped up to receive the medal, he quietly thought of his mother, the woman who once told him that one day her son would do something extraordinary, and in that moment, under the eyes of millions, her dream came true. Glory isn't just measured by applause, it's measured by what you've had to overcome to deserve it. But with that glory came the inevitable. The Beatles entered a life of unimaginable luxury. Million-dollar estates, Aston Martins, endless parties, global fame, it all came at once, and yet, through it all, Paul held on to the most important thing, the heart of a Liverpool boy who once played guitar alone in a small bedroom, dreaming of music as a way to keep himself whole. They had once been one, breathing, writing, and playing as if they shared a single musical soul. But in between the perfect notes and the blinding fame, there began to appear silences no one could fill, and in those silences, each of them slowly stepped into their own world where glory no longer sounded like applause. When the Beatles ended, many believed Paul McCartney's brightest chapter had already been written. But in truth, it was only the prelude. What followed was the rise of one of the most remarkable solo careers and music empires the world has ever seen. Soon after the breakup, Paul formed a new band, Wings, alongside his wife Linda. He chose not to lean on past fame, but to start over. Their song Band on the Run became a global sensation, topping the charts in both the UK and the US, launching a bold new phase that was fiercely independent and creatively adventurous. Through Wings and his solo albums, Paul continued to release songs beloved for decades. Even in his 70s, he remained on the road. His 2019 Freshen Up tour grossed over $100 million, proof that his music lives not just in memory, but in the hearts of today's audiences. He also holds one of the most valuable music catalogs in the world. Yesterday, written when he was just 22, has earned over $30 million in royalties and remains the most covered song of all time. As of 2025, McCartney's net worth has surpassed $1.2 billion, making him the richest musician on the planet. But his fortune doesn't come only from Beatles royalties. He's a producer, an investor, and the copyright holder of many other artists' work. Some empires are built with contracts and lawyers. Paul's was built with melodies and the trust of an entire generation. What's most remarkable? At 82, he's still making music, still taking the stage, still singing Hey Jude to tens of thousands as if it were the very first time. He once said, "I don't tour because I have to, I tour because I can't stop." After all the hit records and world tours, Paul never defined success by the size of a mansion. To him, each home is like a song, sometimes bold, sometimes quiet, but always honest. When people think of Paul McCartney, they often picture the Wembley stage, the roar of the crowd. But few know that the place where he feels most himself is a quiet little farm far from any spotlight. In 1966, at the peak of Beatlemania, Paul quietly bought High Park Farm in Kintyre, Scotland. It cost just $35,000, but what he was looking for wasn't property. It was peace. That old stone house, nestled between grassy hills and sea breeze, became a place where Paul and Linda grew vegetables, raised sheep, and mucked the stalls with their own hands. There, Paul wasn't a legend. He was simply a man living, loving, and writing music with soil under his nails. It was at this very farm that he wrote Mull of Kintyre, a folk-inspired ballad filled with warmth and longing, which went on to become one of the best-selling UK singles of all time. A song that needed no stadium, just the wind across the hills and the sound of boots in the morning fog. In London, Paul owns a townhouse in St. John's Wood, just steps from Abbey Road Studios. The brick facade is modest, but inside it holds a music archive, a personal library, and a quiet studio where many solo works were born. From the wild hills of Kintyre to the cobblestone streets of London, Paul lives between two worlds, one of memory, one of now. He also owns Peasmarsh Estate in East Sussex, a 1,500-acre countryside property where he built an organic farm, a private recording studio, and a way of life close to nature. Neighbors don't call him Sir McCartney. They call him Paul, the man who shops at the morning market and asks about this year's apple harvest. There's no paparazzi here, no show. Just places that money can't buy, spaces that let a man stay true to himself. To Paul, a house is more than a home, it's an anchor. And wherever he's lived, one thing has always been constant: music and the open road, because behind those hedged gates is a garage, not filled with show cars, but with vehicles that have carried him through the real chapters of his life. Paul's garage isn't a collection of showroom trophies. Each car tells a story, a melody without words, a journey never forgotten. As a young man in Liverpool, Paul dreamed of driving himself to gigs instead of catching rides. That dream came true in 1962 with a pale blue Ford Anglia. It was humble and steady, his quiet companion on back roads across England. He once drove it from Liverpool to Manchester with nothing but his bass guitar and a small suitcase in the back. No fame, no entourage, just music playing in his head. Sometimes, something great begins with something small, like a hand trembling on a bumpy steering wheel. As fame arrived, Paul chose the Aston Martin DB5, yes, the James Bond car, but not to show off. For him, it was about timeless elegance and understated strength. His silver DB5, now worth over $1.3 million, is still in working condition, not kept behind glass, but driven with purpose and memory. He once shared that after recording Maybe I'm Amazed. He took the DB5 out into a light London rain, overcome with emotion. Linda had just given birth to their first daughter. That drive wasn't just a ride, it was a new chapter. He also kept a 1965 Mini Cooper Green, round-edged and charmingly British. It's the car he'd take to the market or cruise London's quiet morning streets. In those moments, he said, he felt closest to the boy from Liverpool, quiet, grounded, and alone with his music. That's why, even today, the Mini remains in his garage untouched by time or trend. More recently, he drives a Lexus LS 600 HL, a hybrid known for silence and comfort. These days, he's not chasing speed. He values calm, resilience, and the quiet hum of something built to last, just like his philosophy. Move gently, but deep enough to leave a mark. His garage is modest, a few cars, each worn with time, each scratch, each handle, each quiet engine turn a reminder of life lived well. And across every journey, what he holds on to isn't speed, but values that never go out of style: simplicity, endurance, and kindness. Not just in the driver's seat, but in the way he lives. Paul McCartney hasn't always lived under the stage lights. Most of his time, he's lived as a father, a gardener, and a lifelong vegetarian. Maybe it's the small things that have kept him grounded in the storm called legend. Since the 1970s, while many peers drowned in fame, alcohol, and chaos, Paul chose a different path: vegetarianism, farming, peace, and privacy. That decision began with Linda McCartney, his first wife, his partner, his co-writer, his anchor. They met in 1967, married 2 years later, and stayed together for over 30 years until Linda's passing from cancer in 1998. They raised 4 children, including world-renowned fashion designer Stella McCartney. "Linda was the heart of our family," Paul once said. "She taught me how to be a dad, not to be perfect, just to be present." Their family life was nothing like a rock star tabloid fantasy. On their Scottish farm, they raised sheep, cooked their own meals, and taught their kids to plant vegetables. Dinner had no celebrity guests, just a guitar, Beatles stories, and kids doodling under the table. To Paul, love didn't need a speech, just time, just presence. After losing Linda, Paul had to relearn how to live alone. He battled depression. He stopped writing, but music saved him again, and family helped him rise once more. In 2011, he married Nancy Shevell, a quiet, thoughtful American businesswoman. They met after life had already taught them both a few lessons. Their wedding was small, humble, and exactly in line with how Paul had chosen to live, loving in silence, but with depth. To the world, Paul McCartney is a legend. But at home, he's the man who washes the dishes, writes love notes by hand, and strums bedtime lullabies for his grandkids on an old guitar. He once stood before millions singing Let It Be, but he also once walked alone into his wife's funeral and spent 9 days in a Japanese jail for a few grams of marijuana. And it was in those quiet, unlit moments that the world came to see who Paul McCartney truly is. In 1970, when the Beatles officially broke up, Paul didn't just lose a band, he lost a part of himself to the press. He was seen as the one who tore the group apart, a man accused of trying to control everything. And with the bandmates he once called brothers, especially John Lennon, the bond grew painfully strained. Paul once said, "I wasn't trying to split us up, I just didn't want to be swept along without knowing where I was going." During those final studio sessions, tensions ran high, especially between him and John over songwriting credits and the future direction of the band. The fracture became permanent. The Beatles didn't end with a hug. They ended with paperwork and 4 men shaking their heads, each walking away. How do you hold on to friendship when the spotlight shines directly into the cracks? Then came an even deeper loss, Linda. In 1998, after more than 3 decades together, Paul's wife, musical partner, and the one person who helped him survive life after the Beatles died from breast cancer. Paul nearly collapsed under the weight of grief. He stopped going out, he stopped writing, he stopped singing. High Park Farm. The place once filled with the laughter of children grew silent, like a memory fading in the wind. Linda's photos remained on the wooden walls, beside unfinished lyrics and quiet shadows. How does a man who's lost everything still find the strength to sing about love? Then, in the early 2000s, came another storm, a turbulent marriage to Heather Mills' model, activist, and someone many hoped would bring Paul joy again. But after nearly 6 years, it ended in a bitter divorce, splashed across headlines, with a settlement totaling $48.6 million. Paul didn't lash out, he didn't explain or complain, he just stayed silent and played music. Sometimes, music is the only way a kind man knows how to speak his truth. And there was 1980, when Paul was arrested at Tokyo's airport for carrying marijuana in his suitcase. He spent 9 days in a Japanese detention center. Concerts were canceled. Criticism came swiftly from around the world. Later, Paul publicly admitted fault, no excuses, no diversions, just this: I was wrong. I was lucky to get a second chance. After everything, he didn't become hardened. He became more grounded in love, in kindness, and in the quiet power of moving forward. Some survive storms with strength. Paul McCartney survived with patience and with songs that never stopped playing. Some artists leave behind hit songs. Some legends leave behind entire movements. But Paul McCartney, he left behind a way of life kind, enduring, and quietly beautiful, without needing to prove a thing. As of 2025, Paul McCartney has won 18 Grammy Awards and has been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice, once with the Beatles, and once for his solo career. He was knighted by the British royal family in 1997 and remains one of the most influential musicians of all time. But Paul's greatest achievement isn't measured in trophies. It's in his ability to connect across generations, across borders. He can bring together a 9-year-old child and a 70-year-old grandfather, both singing Let It Be in the Rain when Paul steps on stage. It's not just the crowd that sings, it's their memories that rise with him. Because his music doesn't stop at the ears, it reaches deeper into everything his listeners have lived through. Beyond the art, Paul has quietly poured his heart into giving. He's donated $11 million to PETA, over $17 million to adopt a minefield, and supported numerous efforts in environmental protection, education, and public health. No fanfare, no branding, just quiet, steady action. In 2022, the documentary The Beatles Get Back won an Emmy, introducing a new generation to the band's creative journey that same year. Paul released the photo book 1964 Eyes of the Storm, a raw, unfiltered collection of photographs he took himself. No lighting crews, no setups, just England, America, and the honest view of a young man watching the unthinkable unfold, watching himself become a legend. At 82, Paul still writes songs, still tours, still sings Hey Jude with a smile that's youthful, genuine, and full of light. And each time he steps on stage, no one thinks he has to be there. They simply see that he wants to be there. Because when a person can't walk away from music, it means music never walked away from them. Paul McCartney's legacy isn't just in records, it's in a life that moved through loss without losing hope, that passed through fame without forgetting humility, that crossed nearly a century and still makes the world listen, with just a guitar and a melody. His story is proof that from the smallest things, a lost childhood, a rented room in Hamburg, or a single note written late at night, something profound can be born, not for fame, but for something far more meaningful: to live fully and to live beautifully.